Hi y'all, welcome to my shop. This video is going to be about buying your ultimate lathe. If you're a brand new turner, I'll have a link to another video on buying your first lathe you might want to check out, since that market is normally many new turners targeted at buying mid-size lathes. But there's still some real good content in here for you that you might want to consider if you're looking at your first lathe. But again, this one is primarily targeted at those who've been turning a while, have some experience, and have a pretty good idea that they want to upgrade for some reason. And let's talk about some of the reasons you might want to consider upgrade, and also I want to review all the various kinds of features that you can find on lathes, some that you've thought about, some you may not have thought about. First, for a bit of history, we're going to skip the mini lathe, which is the first lathe I started with, which is 10 inches or smaller. My first lathe was a Jet Mini, good lathe. I've turned a lot of stuff on it before I decided I wanted to upgrade. Now it's serving me well as a dedicated buffing machine, but it's not an ultimate lathe. Shortly after I started turning about 15 years ago, the 10-inch lathe and the Jet really kind of, I think, popularized that entry-level machine for hobby turners. We started seeing manufacturers coming out with what I call midi lathe. That's a 12-inch lathe, or maybe a 14-inch lathe. So they've gotten upsized a little bit more. And they tend to bridge that gap between a mini lathe and a full-size lathe. This Laguna, for example, is 12/16, is what I'd consider a midi lathe. What a midi lathe brings to the market is generally a large enough swing where you can turn a fair-sized bowl. Generally, these things moved up to from a half a horsepower on these 10-inch lathes to generally a horsepower. Frequently, and more often than not, I think, they also came with variable speed control. So this can be this size lathe, not only the Laguna, but any number of others that I discussed in that earlier video, could be a really great starting point. And for some people, it may be your ultimate lathe, if it meets your needs. A full-size lathe is generally a 16-inch or larger swing on the bed, and they typically have a longer bedway. There's exceptions on everything I'm going to talk about, so we'll leave it at that. Now, let me make it real clear. I'm not trying to promote this Powermatic as the ultimate lathe. This is just what I have. We're going to talk about a lot of different features, and because this is what I have, I will use this to illustrate some of the features that are common to many large size lathes. Generally speaking, a large size lathe, that is 16 inches or larger, are going to come with a 1.5 horsepower motor. Some instances there'll be a 2 horsepower motor, such as this Powermatic, and many other larger machines. There's a few larger lathes that you can get it with 1.5 horsepower, which will run on 110, or a 2 horsepower, in some instances even a 3 horsepower with the Robust, the Vicmark, and the one-way if you need a larger capacity motor. Now, when it comes to all these lathes, some of these features I'm going to talk about dealing with capacity, they're generally capable of handling turning within their design capacity. So for a mini lathe, they will handle a bowl somewhere around 11 inches. A larger lathe will handle something larger. Larger lathes will tend to have stronger bearings, but they need stronger bearings because they're designed to handle larger items. You might not need those if you're going to be turning smaller items. Now, most larger lathes are going to come with a cast iron stand. There's going to be a few that might have a steel stand. One of the features to look at when it comes to the legs or the stand on a lathe, regardless of the lathe, for some smaller lathes you can buy them without a stand, and maybe that's a good fit for your ultimate lathe if it's a quality lathe and it otherwise meets your capacity, because you might have limited space, or you have a bench, or you have a table design or a shop-made lathe bench that'll work just fine. And I won't say it'll necessarily save you money. It certainly, buying one is faster. I built one on the Laguna because I wanted that footprint, and for the price of buying one, I felt like I'd get a lot more out of the one I made with more storage capacity. Larger lathes, the 16 inches and larger, almost inevitably come with cast iron legs, some with steel legs. I would avoid certain ones, generally older lathes that no longer sold, that would have a stamped metal frame, which tends to not be as rigid and also tends to be a little noisier. That's something to keep in mind if you're looking at a used lathe, something made in the 40s or 50s or maybe even 60s. The biggest thing when it comes to capacity, the biggest change, one of the biggest changes you're going to get with a full-size lathe, 16 inches and larger, is you're going to have a larger spindle. That larger spindle is going to be 1 1/4 diameter with 8 threads per inch, or if you're in Canada or Europe, it might be an M33, which is approximately the same size, but obviously threaded different and would fit different accessories. Whereas a 1-inch lathe, the mid-size and mini lathes are almost always 1 inch. They're pretty well standard on that, 1 inch by 8. And the difference, that's fine for the capacity of a smaller lathe. But once you start moving up, you need a much more robust spindle, because you're going to have blanks on here. It could weigh up 50, 60, 70 pounds even. So you need that larger capacity. That 1 1/4 is probably 50% stronger than a 1 inch. So it's considerable. As you move up on the larger lathes, typically a 16-inch lathe is going to have 2 bearings. It's going to have one in the front and one in the back, and that's generally going to be adequate for the size blank you'd put on it. As you get larger than that, like a 20-inch lathe, such as this Powermatic, you're going to typically see 3 bearings to be able to handle that larger load that you might be using. Again, if you're not going to be turning something very large, you don't need that larger capacity. When I went to buy my first Powermatic, one of the decisions I made to go from it, I decided to not go a 16-inch because I thought buying once and crying once is better than having to buy another lathe, and I wasn't sure whether I'd be happy. I knew I would minimize my regret if I got a larger lathe. I'd never look back, whereas if I bought a 16-inch, I thought, well, you know, I might have a harder time justifying upgrading from a 16-inch. And for me, that was a good decision. But I'd have to say, probably more than 95% of the things that I've ever turned could probably be turned on a midi lathe, frankly, a 12-inch lathe. Because I don't like to turn big stuff. But it's all in what you're interested in, what the ultimate lathe is for you. A dear friend of mine, one of the best turners I know, his ultimate lathe is the lathe he's been turning on for many years, and it's a Delta 12-inch. It meets his needs in terms of capacity and footprint, because he's got a limited area to work in. So it all depends on the individual, what your needs are. So let's talk about needs. Are you really planning on turning 18, 19-inch bowls or larger, or big hollow forms, you know, this big, or urns? Are you going to be doing coring with big blanks, where you're going to be taking out multiple cores? Because that requires more capacity. You might struggle with a 1.5 horsepower 110 plug in the US, where you're going to want a 2-inch. You're going to want a 2 horsepower, and in some instances, if you're a production bowl turner and you're turning a lot of bowls and coring a lot of bowls, you might be more interested in a 2.5, 3 horsepower motor. If one of the things you're going to be turning a lot of is long balusters, for example, the one I have mounted on the lathe is 30 inches long, you can, if your lathe doesn't have the capacity, you can generally add, in most instances for a large lathe, you can add an extension. This one, you can see, to achieve that 30 inches, the motor has to extend, the tailstock has to be extended off the bed just a little bit, as does the tailstock, to achieve that 30 inches. That's not a problem for me because I don't turn these very often, and this is plenty strong, and the capacity to extend off a little bit was built into it. It's engineered that way, and it's not a problem. But if you're going to do a lot of balusters, you might want to consider or recognize you're either going to might want to get a bed extension, whether it's a 18-inch or whatever it comes, what's available for your lathe, or you might want to buy a lathe with a little larger bed. Some of them are 40 or 42 inches long as opposed to one designed for 35 inches. Let's talk about variable speed. Generally, you're going to want variable speed in your ultimate lathe, and almost all modern lathes have a variable frequency drive. That is, a variable frequency drive allows you to change the speed of an alternating current motor by changing the frequency supplied to the motor, and this is done by just turning the knob. This is a very nice feature. Variable speed lathes in older ones, and it's something to look out for if you're looking at a used lathe, have what they call a Reeves drive. It uses a handle to change the sheaves of the pulley to pull them in or let them out to change the speed. Generally, they're going to have a higher starting range. It might be too fast for safe bowl turning. Maybe the lowest speed might be 500. They tend to be noisy. They tend to be maintenance prone. I'm not saying don't get them. I'm saying be aware of what it is that you are getting. Some of those older lathes, if you buy used, and have been converted to a variable frequency drive. Most of the larger lathes, you're going to have a high torque and a low torque, or a high speed and low speed. For bowl turning, you're going to have one pulley setting, and you're going to have another pulley setting for spindle turning, where you're going to turn higher speeds. For a high quality MIDI lathe, for example, typically you'll have 3 belt changes to give you 3 different ranges, so you can maximize the torque on that smaller motor suitable for the project you're turning. One thing to keep in mind is you can turn small items on a large machine. It's very difficult to turn large items on a small machine. So even though this lathe has, as a 20-inch, has far more capacity than I need, I love it. I enjoy every time I turn on it, and I turn a lot, so it's worthwhile for me. But if you're a weekend warrior, you're not turning all that often, and you're not turning big things, you can get away with a whole lot less expensive machine than this that may very well be your ultimate lathe. Let's talk about headstock features. This particular lathe, and there are some others out there, have what they call sliding headstock. Now, the advantage of the sliding headstock is you can push this thing all the way down to the end of your lathe and stand right in front in a very ergonomic way, which is much easier on your back, and it's easier to reach. Very nice feature. There are a few manufacturers that make what is called a bowl lathe that has a very short bed. They can be a very large capacity lathe, but with a very short bed. It's in effect, sliding headstock will convert it to that style. It does take some effort to set it up for that, but if you're turning several bowls, you can turn it in one way, then slide the headstock down, and then knock out the inside of all the bowls you're turning all at one time, so it's not a real big issue. Now, there are a number of turners that do not like a sliding headstock. They prefer something like the one-way design where it's fixed, or the Vic mark, because they feel like that sliding it up and down, you're going to get dust down here. There's a possibility you're going to get dust or shavings underneath here that's going to tend to cause some chatter or vibration. I haven't found that to be a problem because I'm not doing that often, and I can clean it up. I tend to be very careful cleaning the lathe bed before I move the headstock. But it's a valid consideration. Some lathes are designed with what they call a pivoting headstock. It increases the capacity by being able to project some of the bowl off the bedway. And that could be a nice feature for some people that occasionally might want to turn something a little bit larger than the capacity of that particular lathe, whether it's a 14-inch Coronet Record Herald lathe, which is a 14-inch, but you could turn larger than a 14-inch bowl. The one factor about that, for some people, it's a little more ergonomic for them to tilt this because they can support themselves up against the bedway, and it's easier on their back. Now, there's another design where you can turn outboard, and you see this on the typically on the one-way lathes as well as some others, where you actually turn on the back side with an extra tool rest, or rather bed extension that mounts on the back, and that's a possibility. Let's talk a little bit about the tailstock. On the mid-size lathes, those 12, 14 inches long, the quill, the part that extends out from the tailstock, tends to be limited to somewhere around 2 1/4, 2 3/4 inches projection. And that's fine for working within the capacity of that lathe, but if you do a lot of drilling, you may find it's a whole lot nicer if you've got a capacity to crank that quill out as much as 4 1/2 inches, which would be pretty typical on a larger one. On the Laguna, there are no markings on it for drilling. For most larger lathes, you're going to have etchings on the different depths that make it a heck of a lot easier for measuring on drilling. On some lathes, I know the Robust has it. The newer Powermatic C, the model that I've got, has it. It's what they call Acme threads. They're stronger, and you don't have to crank the handle to project the quill out of the tailstock. I can move the quill, an inch of the quill, I think, with six circles on the Acme thread, whereas it takes about 17 inches on my previous lathe that didn't have the Acme thread. The Acme thread is a little bit stronger and coarser, and it's better if you do a lot of heavy drilling operations. For example, if you do a lot of hollow forms. One of the factors to consider on your ultimate lathe, and it's based on what your value is and the experience that you have. There is no such thing as a free lunch, and cheaper lathes are not going to have the same capacity, or in some instances the same level of fit and finish as more expensive ones. For example, I would suggest that the fit and finish on a one-way 1220 is going to be much better than the 1216 Laguna, which it costs less than half as much. So it depends on what it is you're looking for. But just be aware. For example, I would say the fit and finish, and don't take me wrong. If some of y'all have one of these lathes, I'm not trying to put your lathe down. I'm just trying to describe the features. So they say nobody loves an ugly baby like its mother. And if you're perfectly happy with your machine, then that's great. So I'm going to make some generalizations, and I'm going to generalize and say that a lot of the cheaper machines, and I'm not going to name names, that seem to have similar specs and similar capacity to a more expensive machine, chances are there's going to be some compromises in the engineering. The castings aren't going to be as thick, possibly. The motor might not be as to the same level in terms of its service life. The paint, the way the casting has been finished off, you're less likely to get cut on a sharp edge on a more expensive machine. So those are things you want to keep in mind. There is no free lunch, and some of those things you're not always going to find in the specs. It's something you've actually got to look at the machine and preferably turn on one. And for so many of these things on a machine, on a lathe, it's a personal preference whether you want a sliding headstock or a fixed headstock or a pivoting headstock. I won't say one's necessarily better than another. It depends on what it is that you want and what your needs are. One of the advantages of a heavier machine is that with that extra weight, you've got the capability of turning a out-of-round blank much more easily without the vibration and chatter than a lighter machine. But if you're not turning large out of balance blanks, then that may not be an issue for you. An example of a preference, I had a class with Beth Ireland up at Airmont, and she commented how she did not like the design on the Powermatic, the large square head, even with this cone on it, which is improved over the previous one, because for her it was more difficult to get to turn on this part of the piece or behind a bowl, and it didn't fit her style. I've never had a problem with it. So a number of things, again, are personal preference. All right, let me work through a number of features that I want to comment on. mostly because I want you to be aware of them, because there may be things you haven't thought of. For example, the footprint. How much space do you have? I mentioned a friend of mine that has a 12-inch midi lathe because that's all he's got room for in his one-car garage in a condo. In my case, I've got a little more room, so that's not an issue. But keep that in mind. There are some very nice midi lathes out there for folks that need a smaller footprint. Robust has a very nice 14-inch lathe. Powermatic has a wonderful 14-inch lathe that is just very much of a downscale model of this 3520 with very similar features in cast iron. You've got a one-way 1220. You've got the Laguna 1524, which is kind of, you know, a high end of a midi or a low end of a full-size lathe. So you've got a number of lathes out there that are going to be a little bit smaller if you're cramped for space. One of the factors is, you know, for a larger lathe, do you need a swing away, something to get the tailstock out of your way? Some lathes, most of them nowadays tend to have that as an optional feature. Some of them are fancier than others, but they come at a price, so you've got to factor that in. Many full-size lathes, but not all of them, have the ability to relocate the controls, which is a very nice feature. Do you need a digital readout? Because I started fairly early on with a Powermatic with digital readout, I got used to it, and I got used to just being able to dial in a speed, and it becomes very handy when you're doing things like thread chasing, but also knowing what safe ranges are. I didn't pay as much attention to how something felt or how it sounded. Maybe I should have, and it might have been better to learn without a digital, but that's what I got used to, so I wouldn't feel comfortable turning on one or buying one that didn't have a digital readout. But there's some very fine lathes out there, such as Robust, One Way, and Vicmark, that don't have digital readouts. So again, it's a question of preference in that case. And that would be a factor for me of convenience. For someone else, it might not bother them. Does your lathe need to be mobile? If you need to move it around your shop, you want to be aware of one that either has a manufacturer's option to mount wheels on it, or have a mobility kit like One Way that you can put things on wheels and use a lever to move it occasionally. We talked about turning out-of-bound pieces. How much does it weigh? A Laguna 1836, a very nice lathe, and it's only got 2-inch less capacity than a Powermatic. However, it weighs about 440 pounds, whereas the 20-inch new Powermatic weighs 700 pounds. And the more weight you have within that capacity is the better ability to be able to handle larger out-of-round blanks. Most large lathes are going to have a 1-inch tool post, almost all of them. Midi lathes tend to have a smaller 5/8" tool post, which is okay working within the capacity of a smaller lathe. I prefer a 1-inch. My Laguna, as does one of the newer Rikons, has a 1-inch post for a midi lathe, so that's something to keep in mind. How the tool rest clamps is a factor. One of the things I did not like about my previous Powermatic was the way you had to tighten the tool rest by just having a bolt come into the side of it, and it just never seemed to hold as strong for me. I know some people tend to hit it with a tool handle to tighten it up. That wasn't something that I wanted to get in the habit of doing. This one, the One Way, the Robust, they have a very nice clamping action, which I like. The Lagunas have a feature that works pretty well for clamping action. Under some circumstances, there have been some complaints about if you have an aftermarket tool rest that's not sized exactly the same, it's a little harder to get it tight. There are some ways to resolve that, and if you're interested in that, you might want to watch that video that I've got on banjos, where I show some of those ways of dealing with that. I got a degree in economics. One of the things we studied was economics is a social science of studying about our unlimited wants and our limited means. And buying a lathe, it's generally the same way. Most of us have some type of budgetary constraint that's going to influence what our ultimate lathe very well might be. A friend of mine used to state, for example, that if you took a Powermatic and you put X number of $100 bills on it, it starts looking pretty good compared to a much more expensive one-way or robust lathe. But that depends on the individual. But we do have limits, and that might push us to having to make some compromises. So you need to understand what those compromises are. Through the power of the internet, you can download a manual for just about any lathe you want to get and learn about the detailed specifications. But again, you really want to turn on one to find out what it feels like. If you're looking at a lathe, some of the things you might want to look at if you're not familiar with it, how easy is it to change the belt settings? Now for some people it doesn't matter. I know one poster said he had a Jet 1620 and he'd never changed the belt off of the high torque mode for bowl turning. I thought that was kind of interesting. Height adjustment is a consideration for many people. You can raise a lathe and put a 4x4 under it if you're really tall. That's one way. There's a few manufacturers that have lathe beds that tend to be more adjustable than others. Noticeably, robust falls in that category of having a very adjustable bed. The newer Powermatic has an extension block that you can take off or add that gives some capacity. For others, like I say, you need to maybe put a 4x4 under it. And then for some that don't have the ability to change the height much, you may have to, if you're real short, you may have to stand on a platform. So that's something to consider. Let's talk about new or used. There's some important considerations here. First of all, if you buy it new, one of the things is you can easily find the manual and get the specifications and study it online and easily find reviews of what other people think of that particular lathe. If you're buying used, you've got to have the ability to assess the condition of the lathe, whether it's got a Reeves drive, does it work, is a variable frequency drive, is all aspects of it working, the condition of the bearings, has the Morse taper been damaged. One of the considerations, one of the things to certainly check for is the condition of the Morse taper. Stick your finger in it, is there a piece of sharp metal in there grabbing you? I went out and helped one individual with turning a tool handle. I put in the live center and it just, the drive center, and it just rattled around, and I'd never run into this before. I pulled it out, stuck my finger in there to see what's going on, and I could feel the metal, it's a process called galling, it was damaged in there. And when that happens, it can be, might be beyond your capability of easily fixing that without a machine shop, which can cost you some money. You've got the same issue, not as likely to happen on the tailstock, but again, you want to check out the condition of that Morse taper. You want to certainly look at the spindle threads to make sure that they're not damaged in any way, or not damaged to the extent that they can't easily be fixed with a fine file. Are the bearings very noisy? If so, you might have an issue with the bearings that need to be replaced, and that for some people that could be a challenge. But it is doable. Is there rust on the machine? In most instances, that's probably cosmetic. I wouldn't be too terribly concerned about the rust as long as the machine hasn't been sitting outside in the rain. What's the overall appearance of the lathe? Does it have paint and crud all over it? That may be an indication of how well it was maintained, but it may just be the factor of its use and what finishing techniques. I went up to John C. Campbell with a friend of mine to buy one of their used Powermatics, and the one that was designated for him had finish all over it. It really looked kind of ugly, and he started backing away and got real concerned about it, even though it was a very good price. And I said, David, you know, it may look ugly, but it doesn't affect, let's check everything else out, and everything else is just works just fine. So, you know, you can clean that up and spray a little spray paint on it if it bothers you, and it'll look good as new. It's only cosmetic. One of the factors on a used lathe might very well be the customer support, but if it's a used lathe, you're not going to get any. But be aware of are the repair parts readily available for it. That's the factor you want to consider. For a new lathe, the quality of the customer service is certainly a factor. What kind of reputation do they have? If you're buying a used lathe, you're not going to get any support from anybody. And just keep that in mind. Old can be okay if it's well maintained. The spindle should be at least 1 inch in diameter. What's the spindle size? If it's an odd size, if it's a really old lathe, something made in the 40s or 50s, it's kind of an oddball that doesn't fall in those two common sizes, 3 common sizes I mentioned, the 1 inch or the 1 1/4 or the M33. There's some strange sizes out there that you need to be aware of. If it's new, it tends to be readily available. Right now, since COVID is mostly behind us, the supply chain disruptions for new lathes tends to be mostly behind us. Although, you know, there still may be some issues in supply availability from time to time. With a used lathe, it's, you know, what's available for you, you know, if you can find one. But if you want to go looking for one, they may be a little harder to find the particular model you're looking for. Sometimes with a lathe, especially if it's a modern lathe and you get it used, you can get more bang for your buck. The seller may not be aware of the current value, or they might be highly motivated to sell, and it may often come with some very expensive accessories, whether it's turning tools, chucks, or other accessories. A new tool is going to come with a warranty. Typically that's 5 years for the Jet one-way Powermatic, 2 years for the Laguna, 7 years for the Robust. Parts will likely be available for any new lathe for some time to come. If you buy a used lathe, maybe not. For a new one, it's easy to order. You pick up the phone, call somebody, and they'll ship it right out to you. With a used lathe, you're going to have a variety of issues. Sometimes they're hard to find. The biggest one being they're hard to find. If you really want to get your maximum bang for the buck, join a club. You're more likely to be able to find a used lathe, because a lot of times they'll never hit the open market. They're going to be sold to another club member. Easy delivery with a new one. The truck backs up. They'll have a lift gate service. They'll have a pallet jack, and they can just run it right into your garage, or some instances right into your shop for you. If you're buying a used lathe, you're going to have to make arrangements to have somebody maybe go with you. You're going to have a truck or a large SUV. You may have to have the capacity to take it apart and put it back together and move it yourself. So that can be a serious consideration, especially for larger lathes, not so much the smaller ones. So, but a used lathe and an old lathe can be okay if it's well maintained. One of the things I've mentioned, for lathes that aren't terribly old, the issue of bearings generally don't go out on a big lathe very easily. I talked to the director of the woodturning studio up at John C. Campbell, and they had never had a bearing go out. My lathe, my previous Powermatic, I had it for 14 years, never had a problem. I don't think anybody after me is going to have a problem with it. They tend to last a long time. Do recognize that if you are buying a used lathe, it very well may need some maintenance. One thing about it, if there's any major part missing, walk away from it. Don't walk away if it doesn't have a tailstock. If it doesn't have a banjo, you can get replacement banjos from third parties such as Robust or One Way, and they can probably sell you a banjo that'll work just great, but you need to factor into the cost of that if it's missing a banjo. If you're buying used, you've got to factor into your mechanical skills and abilities and your interest in futzing around with getting a machine up to speed if there are some issues with it. For some people, that might be the fun of buying used. For others, you know, they just want to get on with it, willing to pay that price. I guess one of the last things I would say is buy the best that you can afford. I know some people, when we start getting up in age, you start thinking, well, I don't know how many years I'll be turning. Well, I won't say that that's not a factor, but if you buy quality, there's a good chance that it may sell for more than you paid for it when your heirs get around to selling it. I know that was the case with my previous Powermatic. I sold it for several $100s more than I paid used, several $100s more than I paid for it new, because the cost of quality equipment and the cost of cast iron keeps going up. And I felt like I got a good deal. I felt like the individual that bought my lathe got a good deal. In my opinion, any Craftsman, Shopsmith, or Harbor Freight lathe is never going to be an upgrade. I don't want to insult anyone's lathe. Nobody loves an ugly baby like its mother, but fact of the matter is, those are not likely to be what I'd consider your ultimate lathe. Whether they're perfectly serviceable and meet your needs, yes, they might be, but I wouldn't call it your ultimate lathe. If you're going to stick with it, you're going to want better. But please don't post a comment about how great you think your Harbor Freight or Craftsman lathe is. Again, we're talking about your ultimate lathe. There are a lot of value-priced lathes out there that give you a lot of bang for the buck. Again, just keep in mind, there are compromises. If a lathe costs $2,000 more than another one of similar capacity and specs, it may or may not be worth that $2,000 to you, but they aren't going to be the same quality lathe. The one you're paying $2,000 for new is going to be have some features or engineering built into it that the cheaper lathe doesn't have. So I hope this was useful to you. If you're buying your first lathe, you might want to consider checking out that video of buying your first lathe. And just remember, y'all stay safe. Come on back here.